Now, I am a long-time fan of fantasy in literally any piece of entertainment media. It's easily the best genre in games, in books, in shows, in movies. I am what you would call a connoisseur of fantasy. Okay, maybe that's not true. That's probably not true. My opinions are terrible, but you get what I'm saying. I really, really do like the fantasy genre, and so as someone who's probably consumed it for their entire life, there is one issue that I want to talk about that I think plagues nearly every single fantasy story, whether it's good or whether it's bad. And I'm talking the Lord of the Rings, the Game of Thrones, The Witcher, some of the biggest, the Elder Scrolls series, some of the biggest franchises out there in the terms of fantasy. They all suffer from this problem, which we're going to discuss today. Even some of the best books of all time, The Wheel of Time, Brandon Sanderson's books, Mistborn and the Stormlight Archives, all of these struggle from the same problem, and as you can probably tell from the title, it's names. That's right, it's names. Oh god, okay, listen. These are an issue for literally everyone that I know who likes fantasy names. And this is definitely something that needs to be talked about and probably needs to be sorted out. Now, I haven't read every single fantasy book of all time. I have not watched every single fantasy show of all time. I have not watched every single fantasy movie of all time. I have not played every single fantasy game of all time. But out of the ones that I have, I can tell you that nearly every single fantasy game struggles from this problem. Nearly every single fantasy book, every single movie, every single show struggles from this problem, and that's names. And the problem about names is just the sheer multitude of them, the amount of names that there are for you to consume, for you to remember, for you to apply to faces, for you to remember who they are, what they stand for, their morals, their motives, everything. And then to add to that, these names, they're not easy to remember. They are difficult names to remember. They're long and a lot are very repetitive and struggle, to keep in your head. And the reason I bring this up is because, as you may have told from my last video, I am just doing a rewatch of The Witcher since season 4 is coming out this year. And even though the show has undoubtedly dropped off, it's still The Witcher. I'm still going to be there for it. So I'm doing a rewatch. And even then, on probably my third rewatch of the show, it is so difficult to remember all these characters, all of what is going on, even though I've played the game as well. And it's definitely a struggle. I literally had to pause the episode a couple of times in certain parts to just try and remember in my brain who's who and what is going on. And yes, I have watched the show before a couple times already. That is how big this problem is. And The Witcher doesn't just struggle from it. And I think one of the biggest things that struggles from it is The Lord of the Rings. And that is something that you won't hear from me often. I barely ever give any criticism to The Lord of the Rings. I am pretty much always singing its praises in every single department, and I have barely anything negative to say about it. But if there was something, it'd be this. Now, I'm not just talking about the normal books. I think that in the original Hobbit books and in the original Lord of the Rings books, it's pretty fine. It's actually not that big of a problem. But then when you get to some of the deeper lore, like for example the Silmarillion, it is almost impossible to keep track of all the different names. For example, in Galadriel's family, you have Fingolfin, but then outside of Fingolfin, you have Fëanor and I don't know, Lord Farquaad or something. I can't remember all of the names, of course, off the top of my head. But there are so many names beginning with certain letters, and everything just all mushes together to become exactly the same. It's so difficult to retain in your head, and especially when you're reading a lore chock full book like the Silmarillion, this is a definite problem. Now, how do you sort it out? Well, there's really no easy way to do this, to really sort out this problem and to fix it. But I think definitely one way that would make things a lot simpler is if we just stopped using such complicated names for our fantasy characters. Maybe simplistic is the best way to go. And I say this because one of the easiest ways to remember characters in fantasy is if they're human, because usually human names are very easy to remember. They're usually quite simple, like, I don't know, Bran or Cedric or something quite boring, quite mundane, yet easy to remember. And they make these characters, again, so much easier to retain in your head, to remember what they stand for, what they're doing and everything. Except then you come to other creatures, maybe like elves or, I don't know, dwarfs or dragons, and they all have different names that just sound so similar but are so different and are so long that it's impossible to remember them entirely. Like, for example, I think one of the most iconic names in fantasy media, literally like ever, is Daenerys Targaryen, of course, from Game of Thrones. It's one of the most iconic names you will probably ever hear. I think every single person who's ever watched anything remotely fantastical has heard the name Daenerys Targaryen. But the problem is, when you have just not this name, but multiple others in the same series, in the same book, how are we supposed to remember all of them? How? Now, this video isn't entirely me telling you how it needs to be fixed and what to do, how to fix it. It's more just me ranting about it because, again, I'm not an author. I am not a filmmaker or a producer or a writer or anything like that. I have no idea how to solve these problems. I am just a connoisseur of fantasy, an extremely bad connoisseur of fantasy. So I'm just stressing some of the main problems that I find, but it is definitely something that needs to be addressed because, like I said, human names are so much easier to remember for one reason: they're simpler. They're so much more simple. For example, in the same thing that we're talking about, Daenerys Targaryen, what's another very simple human name within Game of Thrones? Jon Snow. That's literally just his name, Jon Snow. And it's easy to remember. I can picture him easily in my head, and sure, I can picture Daenerys easily as well. But then all these other characters and everything becomes extremely difficult to keep in your head. And one of the main culprits of this is, of course, The Witcher. Now, like I said, on the repeat of The Witcher, I have to pause literally a couple of times just to think in my head, okay, so this character is doing this, but then this character is doing this. So then who is this character? What's going on? And I'll give you one example. In episode 3 of season 1, we have this whole plot with Foltest, one of the king of Temeria, and he has a sister, Ada. And okay, this is gonna sound really weird, but he had an incestuous relationship, yes, an incestuous relationship with his sister, and then she had a daughter who is like this Striga, sort of weird, abnormal creature, which is, weird enough on its own, but then it was so difficult to remember what's going on, who's who, for some reason. And I don't know if it's just me. Maybe I have a problem. Maybe my brain is not functioning properly. I mean, sometimes I can be quite slow. So, you know what? Maybe I do just have a problem. But these fantasy names are definitely getting to me. They are impossible. Literally downright impossible for me to remember half the time and for me to keep track of. That half the time I am Googling stuff. Like when a character comes up and it's like, wait, who's he? Or a kingdom comes up and it's like, wait, who are they? What's going on? Half the time I'm Googling. That's what I'm doing half the time I'm watching a TV show. Literally Googling what is going on. Like, for example, and I remember this when I played Skyrim for the first time a few years ago, when this place was named and that place was named. It was a lot easier to remember because Skyrim does this really well, where their fantasy naming it's actually quite easy. Like, it's really not that difficult. A lot of the names are quite easy to remember, like Ulfric Stormcloak or General Hardest. Like, they're really, really simplistic names like Paarthurnax, and they are easy to remember. Aldrin, they're very basic fantasy names, but for some reason they're just a lot more easier for me to retain than names in TV shows like The Witcher or even The Lord of the Rings and other books. And it is definitely something that needs to be sorted out. And sure, I think names are very important to fantasy. Just as a whole, names are very important. How you create your names, for example, again, an example I've already used, Daenerys Targaryen, that is a very fantastical name. That immediately gives your book another level of fantasy to it. Just these names, they actually add so much to it. Yet, maybe having so much of them isn't entirely necessary. For example, with Harry Potter, they are these very simplistic names because, of course, he's born in a normal human English background, but the names are quite easy to remember. But then you have, of course, the other names like Voldemort, which is a combination of Tom, Marvel, or Riddle, and it becomes very fantastical. So, names are definitely very important to a fantasy tale, making everything seem a lot more believable, separating between races as well. But then the issues come when you're going within these races, trying to remember certain characters, or even when you're coming to remember certain kingdoms or something like that, and you just have no idea. Like, literally, like, who's who, what's what. Google, you are required again. But anyways, that's pretty much all I wanted to say. Just a short rant, no script or anything. I was just talking about the problem with fantasy names because, like I said, on my rewatch of The Witcher that I'm doing right now, it's difficult. Even though I've already watched the show, it is difficult. So make sure to tell me what you think in the comments about this whole problem, if you think it's a problem as well, because honestly, I think it is. And also make sure to subscribe. This is a growing channel. This is only really the beginning of the channel. We've only done 50 videos, and it would be a great help if you subscribe to, really get us going and create a really cool community here. Make sure to comment what you think of the issue, of course. And that's all for today. Darth Sauron, out.